So was the first you'd heard of this, the idea that they could be using the M25 to cordon off London, when they actually said it, when it transpired? They hadn't run this past you, it hadn't been an idea that had been exchanged in terms of understanding what a London lockdown might look like?
I woke up on Sunday and read the Sunday papers and discovered for the first time that in the previous week, Number 10 and the government had been working on a number of different scenarios on what to do if there was a return of the virus at the levels we've seen. And one of the options they were considering was closing London down, locking down from the M25 inwards, not being discussed with myself as the mayor, not being discussed with the 32 council leaders, not being discussed with any other local leaders. And you've seen the chaos in Greater Manchester, in parts of Yorkshire and Lancashire, and previously in Leicester, because of confused communications from the government and mixed messaging as well. And that's why it's really important, this is not a party political point, that the Conservative government, the Labour mayor, the SNP, all of us put aside party differences and work together for the greater good.
So I think by our calculations of diaries, it's been 87 days since you last saw or spoke to the Prime Minister. I think it's been 99 days since the government talked to Good Morning Britain, so it's possibly even longer for us. But the local government minister, Simon Clarke, says that he talks to you fortnightly. Do you feel that that's not good enough because you're not getting the key messages, or is it because you feel that you should be speaking to the Prime Minister directly?
Well, with respect to Simon and other members of the government, junior or senior, they only know what's going on in their department. The Prime Minister knows what's going on in all the departments and must be in charge of the detail. And so it's not good enough, frankly speaking, for us to speak to individual ministers who know what's happened in their portfolio. We need to know what's happening across the piece, the health consequences, the economic consequences, the social consequences, what the plan is if the virus rises in our city. Look, I'm here today at the reopening of the Natural History Museum. They've worked their socks off over the last 9 weeks to make sure this museum, one of our nation's gems, is as safe as it can be. And it's really important that they know what's going on in relation to government plans. And that's why I'd say to the government gently through the GMB medium, because I know although they may not come on your programme, I know they watch it, work with us. It's in all of our interests for Londoners, for those across the country, to work with local leaders, regional leaders. And by the way, scrutiny is a good thing. If you are challenged, if the tyres are kicked, it leads to better decision-making and a safer car.
I mean, you're there at the Natural History Museum. We know that economically the city does need to open up. Would London be ready for a lockdown, this idea of the M25 being a link? We've seen some spikes locally in London, haven't we? Hackney and the City of London. Would London be ready to cope with that? Is it the right move if it happens?
Well, what I've seen over the last almost 5 months is Londoners making monumental sacrifices doing the right thing. It's really important, though, that we're kept in the loop. I think one of the things you need to do in a crisis is to have clear messages and to make sure there's consistency of the messaging. What we're seeing is often, it appears, decisions being taken on the hoof, announcements in relation to lockdowns being made through Twitter at 11 p.m. the day before Eid. And those sorts of things doesn't lead to the public having confidence. I want Londoners to have confidence, in being able to go out and about.
And the city being ready. Sorry, not to interrupt you, but it's very clear that the communication to you is being troublesome. But is London prepared if it happens, or are there things that you desperately want to need to do?
We desperately need to know what the game plan is. Is the government talking about geographical lockdown? I think we'd be ready to have lockdown of institutions. So if we had, God forbid, an increase to do with a factory or a school or an individual place of worship, we think we'd have good plans with the councils to close down buildings. What we'd have more difficulty with is closing down geographical areas. Say, for example, there was a virus spreading between 2 or 3 or 4 boroughs. You've seen in the Sunday papers the government talking about closing down the entire London. Kate, we're served by 4 airports and the Eurostar. So if they talked to me, talked to London leaders, we could explain some of the complexities and work through them. None of this is insurmountable, but let's work together.
There's been real criticism of the test and trace rollout that hasn't really turned into the world-class one we were promised months ago by the government. what we've seen in a number of areas, particularly Blackburn or whatever, is local councils going about it their own way, doing local versions of this to try and get the message out. Is that something that you and London, your fellow councillors, have turned around and planned or thought about for London specifically? Because if test and trace is the key to us controlling this virus, being able to control sort of certain boroughs and then running it out themselves, it feels like, Jonathan Ash was saying this morning, why that works potentially is because they know their patch, they know the constituents, they know the people on the area. Is that something you've talked about?
Yeah, so look, one of the reasons why I'm angry that we've not had a COBRA since the 10th of May is we could test how test, trace, isolate was working. We could kick the tyres and make sure it's working properly and iron out the problems. That's not happened, so it's not been tested, and you're seeing a system that is far from world-leading and world-beaten. In London, the 32 boroughs working closely with Public Health England, I receive a daily readout of positive cases in London, borough by borough, so we know where there could be particular concerns or issues. The council leaders and the councils are working incredibly hard with their own public health directors to make sure we've got a plan in place to test, trace, isolate and support. When you come to visit museums like this, you've got to give your details, so God forbid, if there was a virus, the museum can contact you and let you know, and the test, trace, isolate system can kick in. But these are things we've done by ourselves, not working with the Prime Minister and his ministerial colleagues, and that's why it's really important. Don't leave it to individual councils to be brilliant and do the right thing. Work with us to make sure we've got a plan in place. What happens, for example, Ben, if there's a virus in a number of different boroughs, across borough boundaries, or on the outskirts of London? What's the plan then?
It is odd, isn't it, that he doesn't want to talk directly to you, Boris Johnson, because he was Mayor of London himself, so he will know the challenges. Do you know if he's talking to other, mayors of other cities? Is it a personal thing?
It's been a bit of a lottery. Some of my colleagues across the country have spoken to government ministers, as indeed I have. Nobody's spoken to the Prime Minister. But even the First Minister of Scotland and the First Minister of Wales see the benefit of there being regular COBRA meetings, because none of us wants to go it alone. I've not got the powers, but even Scotland and Wales want to work with the government collegiately. And that's why I say respectfully to the government, put aside the fact that the First Minister is from the SNP, the Welsh Minister's from Labour and I'm from Labour. Let's work together because, in London, more people live than the populations of Scotland and Wales put together. And that's why we shouldn't discover for the first time government plans by reading Sunday papers.
No, undoubtedly. Transport for London, I know this is a real concern for you as well. You want to get the city up and running. You need to get people back into their offices as long as they feel safe to do so. I've travelled on the tube recently the last few days and they've been very, very quiet indeed. Transport for London was forced to ask the government for another major bailout for the network. There's a potential funding black hole of £5 billion. The tubes on Monday were still down 75% in terms of what it usually is around rush hour. How can you persuade people that it's safe to come back into London, and how concerned are you for the future of Transport for London?
Well, we've lost more than 90% of our fares because we followed the advice from the government and stayed at home. Londoners have made huge sacrifices. We rely upon fares from our customers because of the government deal to pay for our services. 80% of our services are paid for by fares, so they've dried up. So unsurprisingly, we've asked the government to support us. They've attached huge conditions to that support. One of them is removing free travel fund for 18-year-olds. Another one is to widen the scope and level of the congestion charge. What I'm saying to the government is we need our economy to recover. We need children to return to school in September. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure you support public transport. Our transport staff have been heroes during this pandemic. Work with us to make sure we've got the investment and resources we need to continue public transport running in London. We've been providing a full service for the last few weeks, making sure public transport is there. Public transport is safe to use. We've got enhanced cleaning, social distancing, making sure our staff are safe and customers are safe. But please avoid the rush hour, because during the rush hour, we want to leave our public transport for those essential workers who need to travel between those hours of about 5:45 and 8:30 and between 4 and 5:30 in the afternoon and evening. And it's possible for us to stagger start times and finish times and safely use public transport.